I'll be talking in these first 15 or so minutes about, the mechanics and formatting of what makes a good CV. So the sort of brief outline is, what is a CV and how is it different from a resume? What do I put in the CV? So what different sections should I use? How should I format it? And then how can the Writing Center help me improve my CV in whatever stage it happens to be in? So first off, what is a CV? It's Latin for curriculum vitae, which means essentially the course of your life. So already when we're thinking about the course of someone's life, we can imagine that it's pointing us toward something that's a little bit more comprehensive than the more tightly focused resume that we might be familiar with. CVs tend to be more academic and research focused relative to resumes, and they're comprehensive listings of experience relevant for a professional position. So on this slide, I have sort of a comparison between some of the most salient characteristics of a CV and a resume. So in terms of length, a CV can actually be quite long. I study, well, right now I'm working on a chapter on an artist who has a CV that's 50 pages long. So I would say, like one thing, note that CVs can take up as much space as you want, and also note that it's probably not fair to compare yourself to a tenured professor if you're just starting your CV, right? So while those might be helpful models, they're not necessarily fair comparisons. It doesn't make sense to compare someone at the beginning of their career to someone who, has, been a tenured professor, let's say for several years. The audience, as I mentioned before, is likely to be academic or perhaps an academic hiring committee for a CV, whereas for a resume, it tends to be more likely an employer or an HR representative. And then the content, right? So for a CV, it's a comprehensive list. So it includes every article you've authored or co-authored or contributed to within a given discipline, let's say. And it's also uniform. So you will likely submit the same CV to any number of different positions or places. Whereas with a resume, it's likely that you may tailor the resume a bit here and there to hone it and focus it in more on, the desired traits and skills of a specific position. And then for similarities, they're both simple, clear, and skimmable. And both documents present you professionally. And you may also include a list of references for both of those. So another thing to have in mind is your audience. I mean, I think with just about any kind of writing project, you want to be attentive to who your audience is. So again, as I was mentioning on the last slide, is it an admissions committee? Is it a grant or request committee? Is it a search committee at an R1 institution? These are important factors when you're thinking about what types of information you could include in your CV. So for instance, if you are applying for a grant or request, it may be particularly appealing to include, let's say, specific dollar amounts for scholarships or grants that you've gotten in the past as a way of proving that you do have experience applying for grants. It's also, audience also matters because you may emphasize different things. Different fields also can have different conventions. So I know I'm speaking with what I'm understanding to be a group of urologists, but right, so maybe the specific skills section that you are using will be quite different from that of folks in other fields. So I would say always try to find specific examples of CVs in your own field, because that will only better equip you to understand the conventions of modeling a CV. Okay, so in this next section, I'm just going to sort of run through the different sections of a CV. So what should I include in my CV? The first part is just the basic information, your name and your contact information. So this usually includes a phone number, a mailing address. It can be either work or private, and a professional email address. You can use a personal email address so long as it's not, I don't know, one of those like AOL screen names from the 90s or something. Just make sure it's professional. So here we see two examples of this. And I believe All of the examples that I'm using are from, so if you go to the link that I dropped in the chat, if you go all the way to the end, there's a few different examples. So I often find it helpful to look at some models. So here we see that beginning information, right? Both start out, the formatting is a little bit different, right? But they essentially start out with a name, they name the document, curriculum vitae, and they have contact information. After that basic contact information, you can jump into the education section. So because CVs tend to be more academic oriented, naming the big degrees is usually one of the first things, if not mostly the first thing that you will do on a CV. So when you are listing your education, do include the name of the school, the degree that's conferred, the area of study and or the major or minor, and the degree that it was completed. And I'm imagining that some of y'all might be in the midst of a degree, as I myself am. So if this is the case, you can say, you can put an anticipated finish date. You can say, you can use an M dash, which is 2 consecutive dashes that suggests this is ongoing, and not put an end date. There's any number of things you can do to signal that. Do not, oh, sorry, I skipped ahead for a second. Do not include your GPA, and generally do not include information about anything prior to your bachelor's degree. So generally it's not considered a norm, let's say, to include high school information. That wouldn't be something most people include in their CVs. And then formatting notes. So I'll get more into formatting in a bit, but as we break down these different sections, one convention of the CV is to put things in reverse chronological order. So the most recent to the oldest experience, let's say. So here we see 2 different examples of how people have gone about framing their education sections in a CV. The first one's a little bit more straightforward, a little bit more minimal. We have the institution, we have let's say the department or the field, and then we also have the degree and the year. The second one is a little bit more robust in that it names, the degree, the field, the institution, the dissertation title, and also the minor. I've also seen people include information like, the advisor or the dissertation committee, or even a small dissertation abstract. So again, I would defer here to the conventions of your own field. After the education comes research experience, right? So when you're thinking about this section, include the names of the labs, the names of the PIs you've worked under, the titles of any projects you've worked on, and the nature of your contributions and the dates of your involvement. So here we might start to get into one possible conflict maybe between CVs and resumes, which is resumes tend to have these bullet points that describe the work that you've done. CVs forego this. So CVs are really, you can think of it more as a factual document. And then supplemental documents like a cover letter or a statement of interest, let's say, will sort of be the interpretation of those facts. So here I just have a bunch of supplemental other sections. Some of these sections you will have, some of these sections you will not have, but they're all worth mentioning briefly here. So one is presentations and posters. Presentations and posters, conference presentations, any of the things that fall into that broad category here include, the title of your presentation, the names of any co-presenters, what conference or what is the forum you're presenting at, and the dates of these presentations. So, I mean, generally, I wouldn't say you need to include like May 2nd, but generally including a year would be a good idea there. Another section, scholarships, grants, fellowships, honors, and awards. So again, name the awards and the dates that you received them. And again, I think usually a year suffices here. If you want, you can include the dollar amount of any scholarships, fellowships, grants, or awards you might have won. Another section, oops, sorry, I jumped ahead. Another section, academic service. So, similarly, I think we're basically explaining a framework in which you provide the fundamental information one would need to understand the nature of the position, right? So where is this work done? What is the work? When is it happening? And if there's anyone else you're working with or under. Similarly, there's a professional affiliation section. So, this organization seems like a professional affiliation that you very well could list on your CV. And then languages. So languages, so you can list languages and levels of list languages along with the levels of proficiency. So maybe you are fluent in French, but only have reading proficiency in Spanish. So you would list things from the most experienced to the least experienced. Here we see some examples of this, right? So here is someone's professional society memberships. Personally, I would include the years, right? And it's likely that these will be years that span, right, more than one. Here, you know, a presentation section. And again, all of these examples can be found on the writing handbook on the page on CVs. I think one of the things that's most difficult about CVs is formatting, because it's both very precise and also there's a lot of flexibility. So some broad rules: stick to usually 1-inch margins and a standard font like Times or Garamond. And then use capital letters, underlining, perhaps even a horizontal line to distinguish among different sections. Distinguishing between and among different sections will become, you know, more and more challenging the more and more experience you have, because maybe there's a larger publication section, but then within that there's, you know, reviews of other people's work, maybe there's solo authored publications, maybe there's co-authored publications. So having to, you know, distinguish amongst those different subcategories within a broader publication category becomes increasingly complicated. Don't be afraid to use a blank space here. Again, you know, like with a resume, we're trying to stick to one page, but with a CV, really, there's no limit. So there's no need to try to force everything into a small amount of space. The most important rule with formatting CVs is to be consistent. So if you stick to a capitalized, bolded heading for education, research experience, stick with that for all of the major headings throughout. Don't change it. It's important that it be skimmable, right? Here we see some examples of how different people have formatted different things. So here, this person uses an asterisk to separate different journals for which this person was a referee. You can also just list things on consecutive lines. So I'm running out of time, so I'll run through some trouble spots real quick. Some trouble spots happen when you don't understand the rhetorical situation, which is generally an academic audience for a CV, when you don't organize content into useful sections, omit important information, or include irrelevant information, when you use ineffective formatting, or when you include false information, right? I guess I haven't mentioned it, but it's important to, you know, be honest in a document like this. Or when you use vague language, right? So you want whoever's looking at this to understand what role you played. Another thing, classic, when you don't proofread, I know personally, the moment I hit send on an email is the moment when all of the grammatical errors I've ever made come rushing to my head. So some next steps, locate strong examples in your field. Take a look at a professor's CV, but also be aware that comparing yourself, if you're an early career scholar, to a professor is probably not a fair comparison. Talk to mentors and professors about particular expectations of CVs in your discipline. Share drafts of your CV for feedback from trusted advisors and colleagues, and find an accessible place to keep your CV so you can continue to add to it as you have new experiences and as old ones continue to occur to you. I will skip through some of the Writing Center information. Basically know that we're available to any enrolled, you know, graduate student, undergraduate student, faculty as well here at UW-Madison. So feel free to look at the writing handbook. I can drop that link once more in the chat. And my email again is urbain@wisc.edu. I will drop both of those in the chat. And, you know, thank you for your patience. I've gone a minute over, but I think I've gotten through the material. So feel free to contact me should you have any questions. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Luke. We have a little bit of time if we have 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Otherwise, we can wait until the end after our panel and you could direct any questions to Luke then as well. So maybe just raise your hand. Chris, I see your hand is raised if you want to ask your question.
Sure. Luke, that was very nice. Thank you very much for doing that. I have 2 questions. One is, Many of the people on this call are not from UW-Madison. They belong to a consortium of researchers that we are part of. So would they also have access to some of these materials that you're dropping into the chat? And second question is, do you have data or evidence to sort of support, certain forms of a CV, how it looks, or what is in it in terms of like what's better received?
Great question. So on the first one, the link is available to anyone, but individual appointments are only available to folks here at UW-Madison. So, I mean, definitely use the link, and there's examples and there's lots of details and information there. So that's available to everyone. To the second question, I don't personally have any data, but I will say if you are applying for things and if you make it through the first check, it's totally within the realm of possibility for you to ask for feedback. So if you apply for something and you make it through maybe the first round and then you don't make it through the second round, it's totally okay and within your rights to ask for feedback. And you can even ask for specific feedback like, hey, did you have any sense of how my CV was received? I don't have personal data. And I think, again, some of this comes from, developing these interpersonal connections within different fields, which seems to be some of the purpose of this organization here today. So I would say talk with other folks in your field as well to get a sense of what are those key characteristics that really work for a urology CV.
Hi, my name is Somia. I just had a really quick question about how you format the language section. So I'm fluent in like multiple languages, but I have native proficiency in one of them, but I have like a minor in Spanish. Do you recommend putting the minor first because I have like official documentation that like I'm fluent in that language? Or do you think that putting the native language that I'm fluent in first, like how would I pick which one over the other?
Great question. So I would say, first of all, when you say minor, it makes me think of an education minor. So if you do have a minor in Spanish from a degree or a degree granting institution, that's something that should go in the education section. In the language section, you want to list every single language along with your level of proficiency, let's say. So if you're native or fluent, that would be probably one of the first languages that you list. And then if you can look up different language proficiencies, right? So there's native or near native, there's fluent, there's proficient, there's reading knowledge, any of these things. So sort of choose the descriptor that best describes your experience. And then again, list those from most experienced to least experienced. And generally it's not necessary to list English if the rest of your CV is in English as well.
Yeah, hi. So yeah, I'm also on the panel, and so I didn't know whether to ask now or point of discussion later, but this is more relating to formatting, and I'd be interested in your thoughts. I'm seeing more CVs, I guess it's maybe more at the postdoc than faculty level, where they include photos and some personal information like marital status or something like that. I'm wondering if you have a general teaching comment about your thoughts on including photos and personal information, because personally I'm not sure what to do with that information or why or understand why it's included.
That's a fascinating question. I mean, I think that has to do with, I don't know, the neoliberalization of the academy and all of these things. I would say briefly that, I mean, I think paying attention to the different forum for these types of information is important. Some of that information seems totally relevant for a personal website. I'm a little more skeptical on whether it belongs in a CV. So that would be sort of my gut take. But I personally haven't seen a lot of CVs with images or marital status included. But like, if you want to include that on a personal website or some other sort of, less formal, more public facing personal infrastructure like a website, I would say feel free to do that.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you, Luke. Okay, so the next part of our presentation, we are going to have a panel. I will introduce the 4 excellent panel members that we have, and then we will go into asking them some questions and then opening it up to the audience as well. So today we have Dr. Maria Hadjifrangiskou. She's an associate professor of pathology, microbiology, and immunology and urologic surgery at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. She received her PhD in microbiology and molecular genetics from the University of Texas Health Center and MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, and performed her postdoc training at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. Her research focuses on biofilm formation of uropathogenic E. coli and virulence mechanisms of bacteria causing urinary tract infections. We also have Dr. Jill Macoska joining us. She's a professor of biological sciences and Alton J. Brann Endowed Distinguished Professor in Science and Mathematics and Cancer Biology and Director for the Center of Personalized Cancer Therapy at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She received her PhD in biochemistry from City University of New York, and her research focuses on determining the molecular mechanisms coupled to prostate and renal disease states, and she works on defining mechanisms through which dysfunctional interactions between cell types within tissue microenvironments develop, and how these dysfunctional interactions could contribute to pathobiology. Third, we have Dr. Jonathan Pollack, who's a professor of pathology at Stanford. He completed his MD, PhD, and clinical pathology residency training at the University of California, San Francisco. His research centers on translational genomics with a focus on human cancer. His lab uses next-generation sequencing, single-cell genomics, genome editing, and human cell tissue-based modeling to uncover disease mechanisms, biomarkers, and therapeutic targets. Current areas of emphasis include diseases of the prostate, like prostate cancer and benign prostatic hyperplasia. And fourth, we have Dr. Chad Vizina. He's a professor in the Comparative Biosciences Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He completed his PhD in pharmacology and toxicology at the University of Buffalo and completed his postdoctoral training in developmental toxicology at UW-Madison. His research focuses on how aging, inflammation, and other processes influence prostate and urinary tract cellular composition, trajectories of cell differentiation, and physiological function, with the goal of helping to elucidate mechanisms underlying lower urinary tract dysfunction. Okay, so with that, I would just like to open it up with one general question, and maybe each panel member can contribute or you can chime in, and then we'll also open it up to questions from the audience. So first, if anyone wants to comment, how do you evaluate a CV for, let's say, a faculty candidate at your institution? Go ahead, Jill.
I just happen to be on a bunch of search committees, so I think I can answer this. The main way, or the first way I think I evaluate them, is to see if they're responsive to the job posting, quite frankly, because they're not all the same. And if we're looking, for example, for someone who is interested in cancer cell biology, just put it that way, we're looking for candidates who have that expertise, and we actually expect their CV to reflect that. And we prefer it when the candidate is very direct about how their skill sets and their accomplishments speak directly to the type of position we've posted. And so what that means is that, in my opinion, CVs should not be written in stone. So if you're applying to a position where teaching is clearly going to be part of the position, say this is a faculty position, then your teaching experience ought to be towards the top of your CV, not towards the bottom, kind of buried behind all kinds of other stuff. If you're going to apply to more of a medical school environment where research is going to be the top priority, then that should be front and center. So I think that depending upon what the components of the job are, you've really got to kind of fashion your CV. And of course, we're not talking about really putting different information in each version of your CV. It's more how you arrange it, so that the most important things are going to be what the search committee sees first. And really emphasize your accomplishments. That's the other thing too. I think that the speaker made a point of that, but some of us were brought up to be a little bit self-effacing. Don't do that with your CV. Okay, you have to actually say everything you've done. And especially if you've got major accomplishments, like say you had some kind of a graduate fellowship or a postdoctoral fellowship, or have achieved any kind of funding. That's really got to be up there towards the top, because these are the major criteria, at least for a research position, that the search committees are looking for. So those are just a couple of my 2 cents on that topic.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with what Jill said. Most of the searches that I've been involved in are so-called open positions, so we don't have a specific topic of research in mind. But we're very interested, I think, foremost in what research the candidate has been doing and is proposing to do, and whether that research is interesting, novel, significant, might complement or expand research within our departments and synergize with other people, but maybe not be redundant. I think a lot of what Lou talked about, in terms of formatting is super important. It's almost the assumption that the CVs we receive will be appropriately formatted. And so we're really looking more at the content, about the research topics, the evidence of scholarship, publications, K or career development grants, invited presentations. I would say, in terms of one comment before I forget, I remember receiving a CV once where the changes were tracked. And there was a lot of comments from various people about changing this or that. And the applicant, obviously, I think in Word, it was sent in Word, not as a PDF, but in some versions you don't see that your comments are shown as tracked, they're hidden. But that would be one thing to check for sure. Anyway.
Yeah, I echo all those pieces of advice, and staying a little bit on formatting, because I think it's important. Like Jill said, this should not be set in stone as a CV, and you should always update it. Update it when a publication comes out. Like, I'll log off from here and add this particular piece of service on my CV. So always keep it updated. Set a date at the end of the month and just add whatever you think is appropriate in your CV, and double check that your publications have the correct formatting. And if you haven't done so already, I highly encourage you start your My NCBI, because that is connected with your ERA Commons, and you can actually take the information from there to add your publication info and your PMC ID. So when you do that for every publication, make sure that the formatting is the same throughout each of your publications that you list on the CV, because everything has to be, I think it looks really professional when everything is really laid out. It's the same font, the same format. And sometimes we do get CVs from faculty candidates where that section is like messy, and that can create sort of an unconscious bias that can influence a reviewer's rating, if that makes sense.
Lots of great advice given so far. I just wanted to highlight two things that haven't been discussed in detail. Luke had mentioned the importance of using reverse chronological order. And when I evaluate faculty candidates, one of the important things to me is to compare how those candidates have done over the course of their careers on a equal playing field. We may have applicants who are really advanced in their careers, have already served as assistant professors for a number of years, versus other candidates that might be aspiring great budding scientists, but who are at the postdoctoral level. And it's interesting to think how you would compare those two. So I'll do mathematics, where I compare total number of publications over total number of years in the field. I also might look at recent trajectory. So I divide number of publications by the most recent 3 years, for example. And to be able to do those formulas, it's important to me to be able to see the the publications listed in that reverse chronological order, so I can clearly see which publication came from which year. It's very important for you to highlight publications for which you were first author or last author. I sort of see those two things as being equal. That's straightforward sometimes, but other times when you're listed as a co-author, unless it's very clearly flagged, I was a co-first author, I might miss that when I'm doing my calculations. So it's important for you to point that out very, very clearly. The other thing that I would suggest, it's important for awards. Not all the time are awards easily understood by an outside party. They might be a named award. It might be a really special and prestigious award for your scientific organization. But for somebody evaluating your VTA outside of that organization, it's not as clear. So with a VTA, you have a little bit more room to explain, and I would contextualize what an award means for somebody potentially outside of that field. For example, I won this named award, and it's the only award given to the society of 13,000 people on an annual basis. That seems pretty important to me, and I would miss those details unless it was actually flagged as such.
Great, thank you. So Chad kind of touched on this a little bit, and maybe if Jill, John, or Maria also wanted to kind of hop on this question, but what is your process for ranking individuals if they're applying for a faculty position? So Chad kind of mentioned how he used the CV in that process. What are your thoughts on that in terms of the CV or even the Biosketch?
Well, again, I think it's the type of position. So, you know, depending upon whether you're applying to more of a medical school environment, more to a public institution where, again, you might be called upon to teach, whether you're going to the pharmaceutical industry, which we sure do a lot of out here in Boston, whether you're going to go work for some private foundation or something, that's gonna dictate how your CV is going to be looked at and how it's going to be evaluated. So if you're looking for a general, or what I tend to get are ones that are more for academic positions that involve both research and teaching. You know, those things have to both weigh almost equally. And I know that's not true in a medical school, like an R1 type environment. But then you look at who is the strongest in the category that you're most interested in as a member of the admissions committee. So if it's research, you look for the person who's got the strongest research record. Have they published well? Meaning, have they published in higher impact journals? Are they productive? Do they have several publications? Have they been able to acquire funding for their research efforts at some level? And then you start to rank that way. And I think that actually, I wouldn't say I'm as systematic as Chad seems to be, but we do have to actually start to pretty much score the individuals in these different areas. And you may not know this, but admissions committees often have actual score sheets, okay, where they are going to evaluate certain chunks of your career. And I know that sounds a bit draconian, but it's the way it is, because you may be looking at 200 applications for a single position, right? And so then you have to go through a series of maneuvers where it's like process of elimination. So just keep in mind that your CV, as long as you're hitting the main points of that the admissions committee is looking for, will be really scrutinized and will be scored accordingly.
Yeah, I agree. I look at CVs as part of packages for an R1 institution mostly. So typically these come with a research statement. So the way I look at them is like Jill just described, plus looking at the fitness of the proposed research and how much that is derived from the candidate. So if you're in a position of applying for such kind of positions, I would say really pay attention to highlighting, like Chad said, what are your specific contributions. That way it shines through the CV and the research statement that the bulk of work that you're presenting is actually driven by you and not necessarily by your current mentor and advisor, because every institution wants to hire someone who is an independent thinker, and they also have a body of work that they are ready to leverage and launch forward.
Yeah, so I can add, so you're really trying to evaluate the, you know, and I'm on a search committee, the potential of this candidate to have a productive and significant academic career, create a body of scholarship. And the best predictor of that is previous achievements. And so again, it's, you know, the formatting is important to emphasize certain things, but the content ultimately has to be there. You know, the publications, ideally high impact or several, you know, the invited talks, awards, grants or evidence of funding. This was commented on earlier. I tend to not like seeing the dollar amounts. I think it's a little base. It could be my own personal opinion. You know, usually by the nature of the award, you know, K word and R1 or whatever, you can sort of estimate or have some idea as to the amount that is. You know, in academics, I think it's not discussed a lot, but I think it's a consideration that you expect candidates to be able to create a program of scholarship that's fundable or funded. And so, you know, maybe in the back of our minds, we're thinking, you know, is this person going to be able to get a grant in the future? And but I tend not to want to think about absolute dollar amounts. Anyway.
Great, thank you. So let's switch gears here because we do also want to talk about biosketches. So maybe our panelists could comment on what recommendations you'd have for writing an effective biosketch, and then maybe thinking about what is your process in evaluating a biosketch in terms of grant applications.
I can start. So I used to hate writing my biosketch when I was like a postdoctoral fellow. It was the scariest thing. And now like through the years, I'm actually enjoying writing them because I got a little more experience. So I think the hardest thing to start is that biographical portion, the very first section, right? And I think it's important, like we've discussed with CVs, for that one to be fluid. Provide the basic information of what you're an expert on. And then the last paragraph, in my opinion, should be dedicated to how your expertise is going to propel the proposed research forward and why are you qualified to perform the proposed research. And then if we jump down to your contributions to science, those are very important to actually spend some time crafting, because as you advance, you're going to be nominated for things like the Academy or for awards like Chad mentioned, and those nominations will come with requests for you to give 3 sentences of why a specific, what is seminal or what is important about a specific publication. So I would say every time you submit a paper and it gets published, sit down and think about what are 2 or 3 sentences that capture the importance of this work and put it in a Word document, and then use that to then edit and develop and evolve each of those contributions to science. Because every time I evaluate a biosketch and I have already read a proposal and I want to see, okay, how is this candidate suited for this work? What have they done before that has provided them the skills and the prior knowledge in the field for them to be the best ones to do these work. So for me, those are the 2 areas that I focus on the most, both as a writer and as a reviewer of biosketches.
I can offer my opinions as well. It's that narrative is very, very important. And I look at biosketches specifically as describing how well an individual fits into the overall. There are some individuals that don't bother to tailor their narratives, and they have a very general statement, and it's unclear specifically how that fits in. When I think about evaluating any grant application, everything needs to fit together perfectly. It has to be the right group of people with the right expertise, evidence that they can work together to solve a problem, evidence that they're capable of project management. And so you can get creative in terms of how you describe your narrative. Your narrative might include information on whether you've interacted with other members of the research team tangibly. Like, I have published 3 papers with Maria, which increases the likelihood that we will have a functional team that's capable of executing this award. Maybe you're being asked to do something independently, describing evidence of achievement as a project manager in any capacity is important. It's important for the reviewing team to know if they hand over a series of dollars to you, that you have that covered and you have the wherewithal to be able to spend those dollars wisely, manage them, and troubleshoot if something is to go wrong. I am very specific about the types of things that I list into my narrative based on the research plan. If it's a training grant, I will talk about my mentoring history because it's very relevant. If it's a research grant, that mentoring history is no longer relevant, and I'll talk about specifically my expertise within the very focused area that I've been asked to contribute.
Yeah, so I think, so Chad's bringing up a good distinction here, and one is a biosketch, an NIH biosketch, which is what you submit with a grant, versus your full CV. And I think in the biosketch, there is a lot of opportunity to actually explain to the reviewer, hoping the reviewer will actually read it, kind of why you are qualified to do this work, who you're working with, how much you've worked with them before, what's your level of expertise in that area, what are you doing that's innovative, that kind of thing. In a CV, it can be a little tough to do that unless you write one of those executive summaries at the very beginning of the CV, which some people are doing these days. That's kind of an opportunity to kind of spit it out yourself in your long CV. But also, we haven't talked about the concept of a cover letter, which if you're applying for a job, they are extremely important. And I just want to say a couple of words about it because I don't know if that was on the docket to talk about. But when you apply for a position, you know, a faculty position, a research position, you're often asked to supply a cover letter, or I think you should just do it anyways, where you do get to explain what I just talked about, your level of expertise, what you want to do, what you've accomplished, all that pretty much in your own words, and where you get a chance to actually say a few things about the institution that you're applying to for a position. Because that's really important that you know the entity that is extending this job offering and putting it out there for people to apply to. When admissions committees look at these things, or evaluation committees, whoever, for whatever level thing you're looking at, they actually are more interested in people who seem to know something about the place that they're applying to, as opposed to just some kind of generic, I've sent this letter out to 100 places and I'm just hoping somebody will write me back type thing. So keep that in mind, the cover letter, the biosketch, and your CV, these are all opportunities to really explain yourself in a good way and make it as particular as you can to whatever it is you're applying to.
Yeah, I can just echo that as well, that and maybe that's a topic for a whole separate session, the cover letter, and often there's a separate statement of research or that's included in a cover letter, sort of summarizing what your research interests are and what your future plans will be. I would say the biosketch, I agree with everything that was said. It's a chance to explain, convince the reviewers why you're qualified to do the proposal and why that you're uniquely qualified to do that. And I'll often use the biosketch to look for gaps. You know, if I've read the research proposal, in my mind, I think, well, need not just a cell biologist, but a pathologist for tissues and a statistician to help analyze the data, or someone in bioinformatics. I'll see if this person doesn't have the expertise, or do they have letters of support, or are they recruiting a team that can provide the complementary expertise that they don't have? And sometimes those complementary expertise or are even pointed out in that personal statement, I think, as Chad alluded to.
Great, thank you. So I here, let's open it up to the audience. If anyone has questions, you can either raise your hand and we'll try to call on you, or you can drop something in the chat. And we'll just open it up for questions. Any other questions?
Well, I guess I'll ask a question. So I kind of wanted to know, and we're going to send out a survey, a link to a survey that we'd like to ask you all to fill out. If, and I think Chad, you suggested this, or maybe John, you did, should we follow this up more with more detailed sort of training sessions about the Biosketch in particular, or anything? I'd like to hear some of the trainees to just kind of jump in and give us their thoughts about what they'd like to do more of. Quiet group. Oh, Bernadette, sorry.
I actually had a question for the panel here, if you don't mind. So we are all in a situation that you hire somebody, and obviously you hire somebody based on a lot of paperwork and an interview here and there. But then once somebody actually starts the job, you start to get to know this person, and eventually you learn whether a person really fits in or lives up to your expectations or not. Have you ever been in a situation where you eventually hired a person and this person really was very different than you expected? And would you then look back and think, like, was there anything in the resume that stood out or in the Biosketch that you didn't pick up on, and in hindsight maybe was something that should have maybe caught your eye, or that could have told you something that you didn't realize at that point?
I mean, it's difficult when especially when you're hiring someone who's coming into their first faculty position, like into their first assistant professorship, their first and hopefully their last. But even at a postdoc level, there's only a certain level of accomplishment that you expect. You're always going for more is better. But there are some individuals, and we've had a couple here where I am now, who look very good, have very good postdoctoral records, but then just kind of failed to make the leap into becoming an independent investigator who could write papers, who could write grants, and actually ended up not getting tenure. So were there red flags in those postdoc applications to our tenure track positions? I don't think so, really. If there are red flags, those are the people who tend not to be offered the position. So it's kind of fortunately there haven't been too many in my experience. I think admissions committees are pretty good at making good bets on individuals who are going to succeed, but it just doesn't happen every single time. And so I think when you're on the admissions committee, you just do your best, to pick the candidates you think are going to be successful. And, 99% of the time you're going to be right. But that 1%, it just seems to happen, and it's just unfortunate. But I don't know if that answered your question. I mean, gaps in a resume, there are things that are red flags, but those people tend to not get to the top 5, the short list, okay, of applicants who are going to be evaluated for the position. So
how much do you take somebody's English language skills into consideration? So I think writing a cover letter is important, even for the simple fact that it shows what your ability is
Oh, people
with
get,
respect to writing.
people have ghostwriters.
Yeah.
They're not always writing their own stuff. And then if they do come for an interview, that's kind of where you find out where the language skills really are, or if you do a phone interview. So that's what I'm saying. You know, things can look really good on paper, but then it just doesn't always reflect complete reality. Okay.
Yeah, sure, it's not just, I mean, the CV is the first step. I mean, you get letters of recommendation. You could follow those up with phone calls. You get an interview. Sometimes there's a separate research talk, or usually a research talk with the interview, maybe a second interview visit. So there's a lot of opportunities, but I can't think of somewhere where I would have gone back to the CV and thought I missed something, but it could happen.
And I want to add something about the gaps in productivity, right? So for the women in the audience, if let's say there is a gap because of maternity leave, it is okay to state that, because if someone is applying metrics to give a comparative score with regards to productivity, I don't think somebody should be dinged for taking time to have a baby. So I think it definitely needs to be pointed out, and I've seen that, and it is, I think it's a good thing to put on there to specify why is there a gap, or if there was another event that prevented productivity for a specific period of time. And also like mentoring and teaching, it was in the chat. I do like seeing that, especially if the position has to do with mentoring students and teaching courses.
Thank you so much for attending today. Thank you to our panelists for sharing their time and their excellent advice to the younger investigators. We really appreciate it. Thank you.